This is Florida Gulf Coast University.
Like many coastal states, Florida's human population is concentrated near the water, which puts most of us near the edge of an estuary, where freshwater bodies and storm runoff meet salty Gulf and ocean waters. We know these estuaries to be environmentally important, nurseries for marine life. But with that proximity, are they important to people as well? More about the impacts on, the impact of, and the health of Florida's estuaries on this edition of FGCU Perspectives. Our guests: Ronald is the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Florida Gulf Coast University. He is also a Professor of Marine Science. Darren Rumbold is an Associate Professor and Program Leader of Marine Science. Aswani Volety is Chair of Marine and Ecological Sciences and Professor of Marine Science. And Mike Parsons is Associate Professor of Marine Science and Co-Director of the Coastal Watershed Institute. Dr. Toll, let me start with you. Just maybe a definition of an estuary when we talk about them.
Well, we generally think of an estuary as where fresh water offlow from the land, and typically in the form of a stream or river, meets the ocean. And so we have a mixing of fresh water with ocean water at a salinity that's somewhere between the two. And it's an area that's very productive for living organisms, and typically an area where lots of people interact with the environment, because it tends to be a beautiful coastal area as well as being a highly productive area.
Which defines a lot of the places around where we live.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Aswani, from your perspective then, if that's the definition of what an estuary is, what's an estuary's function?
Estuaries are very highly productive in terms of the number of organisms that live in an area. For example, estuaries are locations where very productive habitats such as mangroves, seagrasses, oyster reefs, etc. inhabit, and they provide a lot of refuge, food and shelter for many, many organisms. And for that reason, estuaries are very important, because they serve the nursery habitat for recreational and commercially important fishery species.
Darren, and then if these are the functions we're hoping to see from an estuary, what are some of the things that threaten an estuary?
Oh, there's quite a few things that can threaten the estuary. It's very vulnerable, primarily because it serves as the interface between the land and the sea. And anytime you have the population starting to develop around to want to have the habitat, to enjoy that same habitat, the ocean, the urbanization can cause a problem. Then you can have also industrialization behind that urbanization, and of course we also have agriculture behind that. So you have a number of stressors within the watershed that can actually alter the estuary's function.
Mike, if those threats then become reality, if they become a problem, what happens?
Well, you can have any number of problems in terms of ecosystem failure of some kind, where you may have seagrass bed mortalities and they may die back. You may have oyster reef diebacks, or you may not have good recruitment of oysters or other organisms. You may have issues with water quality. You may have issues with harmful algal blooms. Some organisms may accumulate contaminants. You may get large amounts of drift algae or dead fish and things like that become evident to everybody, and then the public gets concerned about it.
When we look at our estuaries around here, Ron, are there characteristics other than just the water? Are there structures? Are there things that are sort of help to identify them in addition to just the salt and fresh water getting together?
Yeah, typically these are shallow areas. They're embayments of one type or another. They tend to have changing borders, so we tend to see little islands form and move through time, and sometimes become larger, sometimes become smaller. They tend to be, in terms of the color of the water, a little bit more green than blue when we think of the deep sea or offshore as we go into, for instance, the Gulf of Mexico here. They tend to change character day to day because they're under the influence of rainfall, runoff, wind-driven waves. And so they're very fragile, they're very changeable, but that's something that makes them very beautiful because every time you go out, they're a little bit different.
Aswani, would you say that we do have healthy estuaries here?
We have reasonably healthy estuaries. From anecdotal evidence, people used to say that the estuaries are a lot more productive in the sense that they used to go out and catch more fish, perhaps go out and eat more oysters, etc. Clearly there have been decreases. Can we quantify it, and is it really degraded? Perhaps not. I would say they're reasonably healthy. Some estuaries are better than others.
Lots of research going on right now to look at the health of the estuaries?
Yeah, absolutely. At least in Florida Gulf Coast University, our research extends anywhere from Charlotte Harbor all the way to Shark River Slough, which is on the tip of the southwest Florida coast where Everglades ends into Florida Bay. Investigators at Florida Gulf Coast University are looking at the health of these estuaries in many ways. For example, looking at the occurrence and the severity of red tides, or how productive are these oyster reefs, or how healthy are the seagrass beds, and how many fish and recreational important species are present in these. So yeah, there's a lot of research going on to look at the health of the estuaries and region as a whole.
The red tides, an area that I think we've all seen the result of. Do we know more about them today, Darren, than we did 5-10 years ago?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. In terms of what's initiating the red tide and what maintains the red tide, there's still some unanswered questions. We don't have a good model to forecast red tides, but in terms of the impacts of red tides, Mike is doing a lot of work on the toxicity of the brevetoxin, the potential for other toxins to be involved as well. So there is a lot of research going on in that.
What might be something we know about red tide today that we didn't know 5 or 10 years ago?
Again, in my area, I focused on the toxin itself, in terms of the fate and distribution of brevetoxin in the water column once it's released by the cells, once they lyse. And a lot of people don't realize that you can't just go out and kill the cells, because that does actually lyse the cells and releases the toxin. So we do know that the toxin can actually float to the sea surface microlayer in aerosol, and then it comes back on land. My PhD work was actually focusing on the sea surface microlayer right at the very top, and we found that the brevetoxin was concentrating in the microlayer, having an effect on neustonic organisms that spend their life stage, a period of time of their life in that microlayer. And so it's, even under non-bloom conditions, you can have very insidious effects. And a lot of people are focused, you can easily see the big effects, when dead bodies are floating up onto the land surface. But the problem is that we also need to be mindful of the more insidious effects, like the early life stages that people won't notice if they're disappearing.
When we talk about the estuaries and freshwater meeting saltwater, in our part of the state anyway, the releases from Lake Okeechobee need to be certainly are a big part of that. What do we know about what's happening with the releases from the lake?
Lake Okeechobee drains water from the Kissimmee Basin from the upper portion of the state of Florida, goes into Lake Okeechobee. And the levels in the lake are primarily controlled for flood control to prevent flooding in the middle of the state. Of course, Lake Okeechobee also has a very lucrative bass fishery, etc. too, as well. When the lake levels reach to a certain level, in order to prevent flooding or breaking of the dike, the water is released into Caloosahatchee Estuary on the west coast and to the St. Lucie Estuary on the east coast. Depending on how much fresh water is released, and at certain times it could be very, very high. For example, it could be as high as 20,000 cubic feet per second of water flowing from Okeechobee into Caloosahatchee Estuary. That would push the fresh water down so far down that even the mouths of the river or mouths of the Gulf are near fresh water, or at strengths of near fresh water, very low salinities. So that does have many impacts. If organisms such as fish or crabs that are mobile, that can move around, they might be able to move from the estuary into a more suitable salinity location to survive, whereas organisms that are stuck in one place, for example, seagrasses, oyster reefs, etc., they cannot get up and move to a more favorable location, so they're more prone to effects of these freshwater releases from Lake Okeechobee. And if the threshold is passed in terms of the salinity optimal for these organisms, they might die. And not all the water is coming off from Lake Okeechobee either. From some estimates that I've heard, about roughly half comes from the watershed in this region, Lee County. So as we are developing this whole area, we are creating more impermeable surfaces, and the water might run off into gutters, etc., and into canals and makes its way into the estuary. And when you look at how much rain we get in the summertime and concentrate all the water and dump it into the estuary at a certain location, the fresh water serves as a point source pollution as well. So that has a tremendous impacts on the salinity and where you define estuary is.
And talking about the fresh water coming from the lake or coming from runoff, it's not just the freshness of the water. Sometimes it's the contents of the water, what it might have.
It's carrying a load. It's carrying a load of nutrients and other things. A lot of mass is being carried by that in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. But I think Aswani pointed out that you can't, it's easy to blame and point your finger at Lake Okeechobee or the control structure S79, but the urbanization has increased the hydrologic variance, and we have a flashy system because in the past, the distant past, all that water would stay on the landscape for a long period of time. And if there's any dissolved organic carbon in it or colored dissolved organic carbon, you can actually bleach it. Now it runs into the stormwater retention ponds, and they end up into the rivers. And as it carries the nitrogen and the phosphorus in the freshwater system, typically the phosphorus is a limiting nutrient, and so it'll cause certain problems there, impacts there for like cattails out in the Everglades. But in the marine system, typically nitrogen is the limiting nutrient, so you can have other impacts downstream. But it's not just inorganic nutrients as well that cause the blooms. It's also organic nutrients that could cause blooms of bacteria and reduce dissolved oxygen concentrations. And we have a lot of dissolved oxygen sags in certain areas.
We raised a question early in the program of are the estuaries important to people? Are they?
Absolutely, at many levels. I mean, one thing is that they just draw people here because of the natural beauty. I do a fair amount of kayaking out on Estero Bay and in the general area, and it's a place that a lot of people find very relaxing, very soothing, very enjoyable. We talked about all the productivity in the areas of these estuaries that supports a huge amount of fish. A lot of people here enjoy fishing. That brings people to the state. That's a good thing. It's not the only thing we want Florida to be known for, certainly not just tourism, but that's a huge piece of what we do. And then in terms of the onshore, offshore community, these estuaries are temporary homes for organisms that come in for certain periods of their lifetime or seasonally and then move back offshore. So these estuaries have an impact to the broader communities that are in the near ocean area and even out to the deep ocean area in terms of sediment transport and sediment sequestration of some of the things that were talked about by my colleagues here. So there's a cultural piece to it, there's a tourism piece to it, there's a strong ecological piece to it. All of these things are intermingled, and it means that these are very fragile areas by virtue of what they were before humans began to perturb them. They're even more fragile now, but they're absolutely more important now than they ever were before as well.
Have there been instances around the world of estuaries failing?
I think probably one of the best examples in the United States would be Chesapeake Bay, and they've done a lot of work trying to restore the oyster fishery, the blue crab fishery, trying to reduce nitrogen loads specifically, as Darren was talking about how nitrogen really can drive the productivity of estuarine and marine systems. So the more nitrogen that goes in, you get more phytoplankton, more algae, and the whole system kind of kicks up into overdrive. And they have many states, and I don't know if 4 or 5 states at least, that are trying to control nitrogen inputs in the watershed into Chesapeake Bay. And it's a lot of money, a lot of effort, and I think the jury's still out on if the response you know, are you seeing a positive response from the estuary? But there might be a lag effect in there too. There might be so much organic matter and nutrients in the system, it just has to kind of clean itself out before you'll see positive responses happening. But a lot of people are working on that.
So nitrogen and phosphorus, natural things that somebody might look at and say, you know, what harm could they do? But it's when they're out of balance, when they're in a
anything in excess. You know, it's just the same as anything. Anything in excess is going to cause harm. So,
what's the future of research on our estuaries here in Southwest Florida?
Well, a lot of the research is looking at what are the critical components in an estuary. It could range anywhere from algae, like Dr. Parsons mentioned, because that really forms the base of the food chain for all the organisms above it. Looking at the relationship between freshwater inflows, the amount of fertilizer runoff or nutrient runoff via ag sources and into the estuaries, and how it might impact organisms such as fish or crustaceans. It could be seagrasses. For example, too much nutrients in the water could form algae blooms that might block sunlight from the seagrasses. So that would essentially kill the seagrasses out, and therefore you're really taking the habitat out of the system. Well, there are a lot of fishes, crabs, scallops, for example. The larval stages and the young stages live attached onto seagrass beds or live and hide within seagrass beds for protection. So if you have too much sedimentation or fine sediments washing into the estuaries or nutrients, resulting in algae blooms, for example, that might cause perturbations in the system. And so some of the main research areas are looking at the inputs into the system and see how the system is responding or how the system is being disturbed, and work with research managers such as Department of Environmental Protection, South Florida Water Management District, Army Corps of Engineers, who actually regulate the freshwater inflows into Caloosahatchee Estuary in our area, and work with research managers in terms of giving the feedback from the science perspective, not just flood control, but trying to protect the ecology of the system and model it as well. That way this can be used in other systems in other estuaries.
About the interconnectedness of these areas, you can't really separate Naples Bay from Estero Bay from Pine Island Sound from Charlotte Harbor. They're all hooked together in some way. Can one area be healthy and another not?
In some ways, yes, because the local inputs are what really drives the systems. For example, in the Caloosahatchee watershed, there is a certain geographic range or area, and that area drains into this particular system. So that has tremendous influence on this system per se. Whereas Estero Bay might be a little more sheltered from these kind of inputs. And of course, Estero Bay has its own watershed. And so whatever is happening in that watershed might drive these a little more. Of course, once you get out into the Gulf area, and when you're talking about transport of organisms or larvae from one estuary to another, that's where some of the interconnectedness comes into play. For example, if most of the crab larvae or oyster larvae are coming from one estuary and going into another estuary, and if you wipe out the first one, the recruitment to the second one might be impacted, for example. And in science terms, we call it as sources, and the second estuary is a sink. So these are connected in terms of the populations of organisms moving from one estuary to another, and the sources of some of the stressors, such as nutrients, fresh water, might be a little more limited for those estuaries depending on the watershed.
Are there, if someone was interested in sort of improving the conditions of an estuary, is it something that has to be done at some large statewide political level, or is it something that you can grab a hold of yourself and go do something as an individual?
I think you need to do both. I mean, particularly when you're in an urban watershed, the big fixes don't work too well. You need to have the small fixes, and every one of us is, a part of the problem. We need to be a part of the solution. I live on a canal that feeds into the Imperial River, all right? So I actually know about the fertilizer ordinance, and I'm very happy that we've started to move toward those fertilizer ordinances to prevent the washout of that nutrients into the canal, because I've had actual blooms in the back of my canal, over 1 million cells, over 10 million cells, I'm sorry, per liter. So it's very important for people to follow those ordinances and not allow the nutrients. And hopefully we're also going to get a collateral benefit, because a lot of people also use weed and feed, and that weed herbicide also if you're not careful, runs into the watershed.
And has a bad effect
And
as
has
well.
a bad effect. So the atrazine and some of those weed and feeds can get in and, again, having insidious effects. So I think the ordinance is a very good first start, but I think we need to come up with a basin management plan and bring the people involved into, particularly in the urban areas. But obviously in some of the other areas where you can have big fixes, that's good too. But it's still not as good as in terms of the bang for the buck to prevent the fertilizers from getting in the water in the first place, rather than spending all this money to try to take them out.
When you said bring the people involved, you're talking...
Educate the people,
Okay.
yeah, that live along these rivers, that enjoy the habitat just as much. That's why they're paying millions of dollars to live on that water. They should be taking care of that habitat.
And to be aware that there are solutions, like where they can
Exactly.
put slow release fertilizers or keep them off in times that they don't really need them.
Right, and then buffer areas away from the water. Don't put them there. I mean, for a short period of time, I was actually having a lawn care service, and they would actually spray the riprap with the herbicide, and I had to actually tell them to stop. I don't care if there's weeds coming up between the rocks.
If it comes at the cost of having an herbicide going
into the water.
And that's really the nice piece about this, because everybody can have a little bit of an effect, and those things are additive through time. If you see some monofilament line caught up somewhere, you see a bit of a fishing net, you see an old trap off to the side that's rusting and obviously been now part of what we sometimes call ghost gear. It continues to capture stuff even when it's not being tended. Pull that stuff out. And what's nice to see is when we see boaters and kayakers and canoers coming back, and they've pulled some of this stuff up. If you happen to come across some lead fishing weights, we're replacing lead in fishing weights now because that's known to be toxic. We took lead out of paints years and years ago for the same reason. Pull those up. And at Florida Gulf Coast University, we're very proud of our oyster reef restoration project. We just had one last weekend. We get a couple of hundred people out there. We're taking bags of, interestingly, million-year-old fossil shells, and we're putting them into biodegradable bags. We're putting those out on the bottom in a couple areas of Stero Bay, and we're encouraging the natural growth that needs that hard bottom there, like the oysters, which land as larvae and form what we call oyster spat. That also contributes to increasing crab populations and then fish populations. So when there's an opportunity to help out, even for a few hours, people can make a difference.
And that's the kind of thing that Aswani mentioned. They don't crawl anywhere. They don't go anywhere. Once you've built back an oyster reef, it stays for a while.
It stays there pretty much through the life of those oysters, and they do come and go through time, and they come and go naturally through time. We can have a hurricane event. We can have a siltation event that's perfectly natural. Unfortunately, what we've done is introduce a lot of unnatural man-made conditions that's hastening some of these natural processes. And so these oscillations of building these reefs and destroying these reefs, particularly the destruction of these reefs, has been accelerated. And so we can do some small things to help out.
So what can somebody do to get better educated? Where can somebody find more information about how to help out the estuary, support the efforts?
Well, Dr. Toll mentioned about the reef restoration program, for example. Dr. Parsons heads another group, Solutions Toward Red Tide. We invite the community to our marine field station that's in Estero Bay, show them what a red tide looks like, look for the signs of red tide, enumerating, participate in the project. And for example, as part of this oyster reef restoration, we work with a lot of fellow citizens that live along the canals and boat docks, etc. It's a concept called oyster gardening that started in Chesapeake Bay. You give these volunteers floating cages, essentially, along with baby oysters or juvenile oysters. And every month they clean the cages, look at the growth of the oysters and the survival, etc., and send us the information back. So this way it enables the researchers to look at this on a larger scale and stuff. Us looking at 5 or 6 locations, we might get information from 200 locations. And in the future, when we look at restoration of a certain area, and resources are limited, in this case, dollars are limited, So we can look at the big picture and say this area has a better chance of success compared to this one. So the marine science and the environmental science programs are very involved in terms of working with community. Our students do internships and senior projects, and there is a lot of service learning. In other words, whatever they're learning in the classroom as part of their curriculum, they take it out to the community, work with them to come up with solutions to some of the environmental problems as well.
Dr. Toll, just in the last few seconds that we have, what do you see as a future of FGCU's involvement with improving estuaries?
We will continue to be at the center of research in the Southwest Florida area. We have an exceptional program built on just great faculty, tremendous interest from students, and tremendous interest from the community because of all the things we were talking about earlier. So FGCU looks forward to being kind of the nexus of research that brings together public agencies, local corporations, interested community, our students and our faculty to do great things for our estuaries into the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you all, and thank you for watching this edition of FGCU Perspectives.